A theory was written, policies were justified, and millions died. This is not the story of a general or a king. This is the story of an economist. In 1798, a quiet English scholar published a slim book with a very long title, an essay on the principle of population. The author was Thomas Robert Malthus, a clergyman and economist who believed he had uncovered a brutal law of nature. His claim was simple, elegant, and ultimately catastrophic. He argued that population, when unchecked, grows much faster than our ability to produce food. Therefore, poverty, famine, and death are not failures of society. They are natural, even necessary, corrections. To Malthus, hunger wasn't a tragedy to be solved. It was a necessity to be accepted. This idea would not stay on paper. It would travel across oceans into the halls of government, the boardrooms of empires, and the offices of policymakers. And when it did, it would help justify some of the deadliest famines in human history. This is the story of how an idea can become a weapon. Let's break down Malthus's core theory. He argued that population grows geometrically, think 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, while food production grows arithmetically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. According to this model, it's just a matter of time before population outstrips the available resources. When that tipping point is reached, Malthus said, nature itself intervenes through what he called positive checks. These checks were famine, disease, and war. In his view, these weren't evils to be prevented. They were necessary mechanisms to restore balance between people and food. From this perspective, helping the poor, providing aid to the starving, only made things worse. He famously wrote that giving food to the starving only encourages more starving. This wasn't cruelty in his mind, it was cold, hard logic. It was a logic that would soon gain enormous power because it told the powerful exactly what they wanted to hear. So why did empires, especially the British Empire, fall in love with Malthus's theory? You have to understand the timing. Malthus was writing at the height of British colonial expansion. The empire ruled over vast, impoverished populations, particularly in places like India and Ireland. Now, if that poverty was the result of structural problems, political oppression, or economic exploitation, then the empire was responsible. It would be an indictment of their rule. But if poverty and famine were just natural, inevitable laws of population, then the empire was innocent. Malthus gave colonial administrators something priceless, moral permission to do nothing. He washed their hands of responsibility. Let's look at Ireland. In the 1840s, the Great Potato Famine struck. The potato crop, the primary food source for millions of poor Irish, failed due to blight. People began starving. But here is the critical fact that is so often ignored. Ireland was still exporting food to England throughout the famine. Grain, beef, butter, and other foodstuffs continued to leave Irish ports while the Irish people starved. Why? British officials, deeply influenced by Malthusian thinking, had their justification ready. They argued that the famine was nature's way of correcting Ireland's overpopulation. They believed that providing widespread relief would only delay the inevitable and encourage dependency. Charles Trevelyan, the British official in charge of famine relief, was a devout follower of Malthus. He explicitly described the famine as the judgment of God and a sharp but effectual remedy for Ireland's problems. Food aid was deliberately limited. Public works programs designed to provide employment were made intentionally harsh and cruel, often to the point of being useless. The result? Over 1 million people died of starvation and disease. Another million were forced to emigrate, scattering across the globe. This was not a natural disaster that couldn't be helped. It was ideology in action, it was policy driven by a theory. And this horrifying story repeats itself on an even more brutal scale in British India. Between the late 18th and early 20th centuries, India experienced dozens of major famines under British rule. Two of the most infamous are the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 and the Bengal Famine of 1943. And in these famines, just like in Ireland, a chilling pattern emerges. Food existed. The granaries were not always empty. In fact, grain prices often rose because of speculation, and food exports sometimes continued. Relief efforts were intentionally restricted. Why? The logic was the same. British administrators, armed with Malthusian doctrine, believed that famine was a self-correcting mechanism for overpopulation. One official during the Great Famine famously said, "Every benevolent attempt made to mitigate the effects of famine serves but to enhance the evils resulting from it." Let that sink in. They believed that helping people was actively harmful. People were dying not because there was an absolute lack of food in the world or even in the country, but because the act of helping them was considered economically and morally wrong. During the Bengal famine of 1943, an estimated 3 million people died. Winston Churchill's government repeatedly rejected pleas for large-scale food shipments, with Churchill himself reportedly blaming the Indians for breeding like rabbits. That is the language of Malthus, echoed nearly 150 years after he first wrote his essay. The theory had become dogma. So the question is, did Malthus predict reality, or did his ideas help create it? Defenders of Malthus argue he was just a man of his time. He couldn't possibly have foreseen the incredible technological revolutions in agriculture that were to come. He was simply warning about real, physical constraints. But critics point out something far darker. Malthus didn't just predict suffering. His ideas were actively used to justify it and, in many cases, to create policies that made it worse. What Malthus completely failed to anticipate was human ingenuity. He didn't see the coming of industrial agriculture, synthetic fertilizers, global trade networks, and incredible leaps in crop yields. Food production did not grow arithmetically. It exploded exponentially, far outpacing even the most rapid population growth. The world today produces more than enough food to feed everyone, but policies, attitudes, and power structures often remain frozen in a Malthusian mindset of fear and scarcity. The problem was never truly about there being too many people. The problem was, and often still is, about who is allowed to eat. It's about distribution, economics, and politics, not biology. The most lethal part of Malthus's theory wasn't the math. It was the moral framework. By framing famine and poverty as natural, it makes responsibility vanish. If hunger is just a law of nature, like gravity, then governments are not guilty. Empires are not accountable. The deaths of millions become unfortunate statistics, not criminal acts of negligence or policy. This mindset didn't die with the British Empire. It reappears again and again anytime poverty is blamed on the poor themselves. You hear its echoes when people talk about overpopulation in developing nations, or blame cultural failures, or talk about inevitable scarcity, instead of looking at broken systems, unequal distribution of resources, and the dynamics of power. Thomas Malthus never ordered food shipments to be stopped. He never personally signed a famine relief policy into law. He never stood over a starving village in Ireland or Bengal. But his ideas stood there instead. They whispered into the ears of officials, "Don't intervene. This is necessary. This is nature at work." And when an idea gains that kind of authority, it can kill just as surely as any weapon. So remember this, the deadliest ideas are not always the ones that call for violence. Sometimes they are written politely in academic books by well-meaning economists. They offer simple answers to complex problems and, in doing so, provide a justification for indifference. The theory survived, millions did not. Thanks for watching. If you found this story important, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the ideas that shape our world.